didn't arrive with noise. No warning, no announcement, no dramatic moment that told you your life was about to change. It started quietly, almost too quietly to notice. A conversation that suddenly felt cold. A room that became uncomfortable the moment you entered. People you once trusted becoming distant without explanation. At first, you blamed yourself. You replayed every word in your head, every interaction, every mistake you thought you made. Because when people slowly disappear from your life, the human mind searches for reasons. But what if the reason had nothing to do with failure? What if something was changing inside you before you even realized it yourself? There's something strange that happens when a person begins transforming internally. The old world around them starts reacting first. Not because people consciously understand it, but because energy changes behavior before words ever do. And that's what confused you. The sudden resistance, the strange tension, the feeling that life itself had become heavier overnight. You thought you were losing people, but in reality, you were losing alignment with the version of yourself that once needed to be That's why the isolation felt so brutal, because it wasn't ordinary loneliness, it was separation, a transition between who you were and who you were becoming. Most people never experience this. Most people stay connected to environments that slowly destroy them. They ignore their instincts, silence their inner voice, continue shrinking themselves just to remain accepted. But your life began pulling you away from comfort, and comfort fought to keep you trapped. That's why the attacks became subtle before they became obvious. People stopped celebrating your progress. Small achievements made others uncomfortable. Your presence started exposing insecurities you never intended to reveal. You noticed it in their eyes first. That strange reaction when you walked into a room calmer than before. Because peace intimidates people who are internally chaotic. And the strangest part? You weren't even trying to change anyone. You were simply trying to survive your own battles. But survival transformed you. Pain transformed you. The nights nobody checked on you transformed you. There's a version of yourself that only solitude could create. Not attention, not applause. Solitude. Because isolation has a way of forcing honesty onto a person. When the distractions disappear, you finally hear your own thoughts clearly. And for many people, that silence becomes unbearable. But for you, the silence became a mirror. You started seeing patterns, the relationships that drained you, the environments that weakened your confidence, the habits that kept your mind exhausted. And suddenly, your old life stopped feeling normal. That's when everything became uncomfortable. Growth is rarely dramatic in the beginning. It feels confusing. You outgrow conversations you once enjoyed. You become exhausted around negativity. You start craving distance without understanding why. And people take that personally. Especially those who benefited from the older version of you. The version that tolerated disrespect. The version that constantly explained itself. The version that sacrificed inner peace just to avoid conflict. But once a person discovers their value internally, their energy changes permanently. And not everyone survives that shift. Some people only loved your accessibility, not your evolution. That's why they became cold aware. You became stronger. Not louder, not arrogant, just stronger, emotionally stronger, spiritually calmer. And calmness is dangerous to people who survive through emotional control, because they can no longer manipulate your reactions. That's why some battles in your life were never meant to destroy you. They were meant to exhaust the weaker identity you had outgrown. Think about it. Every difficult season forced something out of you. The betrayal forced awareness. The loneliness forced independence. The confusion forced self-reflection. Your failures carried hidden direction, because every collapse removed another illusion. And illusions are dangerous, especially the illusion that external approval determines your worth. That illusion keeps people trapped for decades, performing, pretending, begging to be understood. But once life removes enough comfort, a person either breaks completely or awakens. And your awakening didn't happen all at once. It happened slowly. Silence. You stopped reacting immediately. Stopped explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. Stopped chasing connections that only existed when you were useful. That shift changed everything. Because people notice when they no longer have emotional access to you. Your silence started speaking louder than your words ever did. And that confused them. Because they expected emotional chaos. They expected desperation. They expected you to collapse after the separation. But instead, you became harder to reach emotionally. Not cold, just aware. Aware of manipulation. Aware of energy. Aware of how exhausting constant survival mode truly was. That awareness became your protection. And protection changes a person. You stop entering every room trying to prove yourself. You stop lowering your standards for temporary acceptance. You stop begging for understanding you. Instead, you observe. You listen. You recognize patterns faster. And suddenly, the same world that once overwhelmed you begins revealing itself differently. You start seeing hidden motives behind behavior. You notice insecurity disguised as arrogance. You recognize how many people operate from fear instead of authenticity. That realization can feel isolating. Because once you truly see people clearly, you can never fully unsee them again. And that's where many transformations become painful. Not because you're becoming worse, but because your awareness no longer allows fake peace. You begin craving something deeper. Real conversations, real loyalty, real purpose. Surface-level living no longer satisfies your spirit. That's why your old environment began feeling emotionally heavy. You were evolving internally while everything around you remained emotionally stagnant. And growth creates distance. Not because you hate people, but because your soul can no longer survive inside environments that shrink it. There comes a moment in every transformation journey where you realize you were never abandoned. You were redirected. Those closed doors, redirection. Those painful endings, redirection. Those periods of complete uncertainty, also redirection. Because sometimes life removes people before they can delay your next season. And at first, that removal feels cruel, especially when you loved sincerely, especially when your intentions were pure. But sincerity alone cannot save misaligned connections. Some people are only assigned to a chapter of your life, not the entire story. And the longer you resist that truth, the more painful growth becomes. That's why your life became quieter, not as punishment, as preparation. There are things clarity can only teach in silence. That's why your strongest ideas appeared when nobody was around. Your deepest realizations happened during isolation. Your greatest emotional breakthroughs came after disappointment. Pain stripped away distraction, and distraction was blocking your evolution. Most people spend their entire lives avoiding themselves. Constant noise, constant entertainment, constant validation. Anything to escape inner confrontation. But your path forced confrontation. You had to face fears directly, face rejection directly, and surviving that changes a person permanently. Because once someone survives emotional darkness alone, they stop fearing temporary discomfort. That's when resilience is born, not through motivation, through endurance. Real strength is quiet. It doesn't announce itself online. It doesn't beg for attention. It doesn't need constant recognition. Real strength is the ability to remain grounded while everything around you becomes uncertain. And uncertainty shaped you. Every unpredictable season sharpened your instincts. You learned how quickly people switch during difficult times. You learned who disappears when you stop overextending yourself. You learned that loyalty spoken loudly is often weaker than loyalty shown silently. Those lessons cost pain, but they also built discernment. And discernment protects destiny. Because not every opportunity is alignment. Not every connection is genuine. Not every invitation deserves access to your energy. That understanding changes how you move through life. You become more intentional, more protective of your peace, more selective with your time, more aware of what drains your spirit. And strangely enough, the more grounded you become, the more certain people misunderstand you. Some will call your distance arrogance. Others will call your silence weakness. But people interpret transformation through the limits of their own awareness, not yours. And that's important to remember. Because if you spend your life trying to be understood by everyone, you'll eventually lose yourself completely. Some paths require misunderstanding. Some transformations required isolation. Some evolutions require temporary separation from nearly everything familiar. Not because you're cursed, because growth demands space. A seed cannot become a tree while remaining buried forever. At some point, it must break open. And breaking open looks messy before it looks beautiful. That's what your life has been. An internal breaking. The collapse of old thinking, old survival patterns, old emotional attachments. And although painful, that collapse created room for something stronger. A calmer mind, a clearer intuition, a deeper understanding of yourself. You stopped needing external applause to trust your direction. And that changes everything. Because once a person develops internal certainty, outside opinions lose power. That's why your energy now feels different. You no longer chase every opportunity, no longer force every relationship, no longer panic when people walk away. You've learned something most people never understand. What belongs in your life will not require you to abandon yourself to keep it. Read that again internally. What belongs in your life will not require self-betrayal. And every painful lesson was teaching you exactly that. The world often rewards performance temporarily, but authenticity lasts longer. That's why pretending became exhausting for you. You were never meant to live disconnected from your deeper instincts. That internal voice inside you, the one warning you about people, warning you about environments, warning you about decisions, it was never trying to destroy your happiness. It was trying to protect your future. But protection rarely feels comfortable in the moment. Sometimes protection looks like endings. Sometimes it looks like isolation. Sometimes it looks like losing everything familiar before discovering what truly aligns with you. And that process can feel terrifying, because humans naturally attach identity to stability. But real transformation often begins when stability disappears, when routines collapse, when expectations fail, when certainty vanishes. That's when hidden strength emerges, not before. And maybe that's why your hardest seasons created your strongest mindset. You learned how to survive uncertainty, how to continue moving without immediate answers, how to trust your inner direction even when external evidence looked unclear. That kind of growth cannot be taught through comfort. It must be experienced. That's why your journey feels different from others around you. You weren't simply trying to succeed externally. Life was rebuilding you internally. And internal reconstruction takes time. It requires solitude, reflection, detachment. It requires moments where nothing makes sense temporarily. Because confusion often appears right before clarity expands. And many people quit during that stage. They return to distractions, return to unhealthy cycles, return to environments that slowly weaken their spirit. But something inside you kept pushing forward, even during exhaustion, even during loneliness, even during moments where giving up felt easier than continuing. There was still a quiet voice inside you saying, "Keep going," not loudly, not dramatically, just consistently. And that voice matters more than you realize, because transformation rarely arrives through one massive moment. It arrives through repeated internal decisions. The decision to heal instead of harden. The decision to reflect instead of react. The decision to grow instead of collapse. Those invisible decisions shape destiny, quietly, long before visible results appear. That's why people often misunderstand transformed individuals. They only notice the outcome, not the internal battles required to become that person. They see confidence, but not the years of self-doubt overcome in silence. They see calmness, but not the emotional storms survived privately. They see strength, but not the nights you questioned whether you had any left. And maybe that's why your journey had to become lonely for a while. Because some strengths can only develop without constant external interference. Some wisdom only arrives through observation. Some identities only emerge after isolation strips away performance. And now, you're no longer becoming who you used to be. You're becoming someone far more aware, more intentional, more emotionally disciplined, more connected to what truly matters. That doesn't mean life suddenly becomes easy, but it does mean you stop fearing yourself. You stop doubting your intuition every time it warns you. Stop abandoning your peace for temporary acceptance. Stop shrinking your identity just to fit inside rooms you've already outgrown. And once that shift happens internally, your entire reality begins changing externally. Not instantly, but gradually. Because internal alignment eventually affects everything. Your decisions, your relationships, your standards, future. That's why your isolation was never empty. It was preparation. Preparation for the version of yourself that could no longer survive unconsciously. And maybe that's what they never understood about you. The pressure didn't destroy you. It revealed you. Every difficult season uncovered another layer of hidden resilience. Every disappointment forced deeper awareness. Every ending pushed you closer toward authenticity. And authenticity carries a different kind of power. Quiet power. The kind that doesn't need validation, doesn't compete constantly, doesn't chase attention desperately. Because once someone truly discovers themselves internally, they stop seeking permission externally. And that changes the way they move through the world forever. So if your life has felt strange lately, if relationships feel distant, if solitude keeps appearing, if your old identity no longer feels comfortable, don't ignore that transition. Something deeper may be unfolding within you, not punishment. Transformation. The kind that separates performance from authenticity. The kind that forces emotional maturity. The kind that teaches you how to stand alone without abandoning yourself. Because in the end, the people who change the most are rarely the loudest ones. They are usually the individuals who survived silent battles nobody else could see. The ones who rebuilt themselves privately. The ones who learned how to remain soft without becoming weak. The ones who transformed pain into awareness instead of bitterness. And maybe that's been your real journey all along. Not becoming perfect, becoming real. Because real strength was never about dominating others. It was about mastering yourself. And once that happens, everything changes. There comes a quiet moment in life when a person becomes tired of explaining themselves, tired of repeating their intentions, tired of proving their heart, tired of trying to convince people they were never trying to hurt anyone in the first place. And for a long time, you probably believed being understood was necessary for peace. You thought if people could just see your perspective, if they could just understand your struggle, your loneliness, your sincerity, then maybe everything would finally become easier. But life has a strange way of teaching deeper truths through disappointment. Because eventually you realize something painful. Not everyone is committed to understanding you. Some people only understand the version of you that benefits them. The version that stays quiet to keep others comfortable. The version that over-explains. The version that sacrifices inner peace just to avoid conflict. And the moment you stop doing that, everything changes. At first, the change feels uncomfortable. You notice how many relationships depended on your constant emotional effort. How many conversations only survived because you kept carrying them. How many people enjoyed access to your energy, but never truly tried to understand your soul. That realization can feel heavy, because humans naturally want connection. We want to feel seen, accepted. But there is a difference between healthy connection and emotional dependence on validation. And many people spend years trapped inside that cycle, constantly shaping themselves around the expectations of others, constantly editing their personality to avoid rejection, constantly shrinking their truth just to remain accepted in environments that never truly appreciated them. But something inside you started changing. You became exhausted by performance, exhausted by pretending, exhausted by forcing understanding where there was no willingness to listen. And slowly, without even realizing it, you stopped chasing approval. You stopped explaining every decision, stopped defending every boundary, stopped trying to convince people of your worth. Not because you became cold, but because you finally understood something powerful. Real peace begins when your identity no longer depends on outside permission. That's when your energy shifts. Because when a person no longer begs to be understood, they begin understanding themselves more deeply. And self-understanding creates a different kind of confidence, a quieter confidence. The kind that doesn't need constant attention, doesn't panic when misunderstood, doesn't collapse every time someone walks away, because your strength is no longer built on opinions. It's built on awareness, awareness of who you are, Awareness of what drains your spirit. Awareness, essence of what you will no longer tolerate just to keep temporary connections alive. And strangely enough, that's when your real power begins appearing. Not loud power, not arrogant power, inner power. The ability to remain calm in situations that once controlled your emotions. The ability to walk away from disrespect without explaining yourself endlessly. The ability to trust your intuition even when others disagree. That kind of strength changes your entire life. Because once a person stops begging to be understood, they stop abandoning themselves just to be accepted. They thought the silence would weaken you. They thought the distance would exhaust you. That the loneliness would slowly drain your confidence. That being separated from people, comfort and familiarity would eventually make you collapse under the weight of your own thoughts. And maybe, in the beginning, it almost did, because isolation is uncomfortable when you first encounter it. The human mind naturally searches for connection, for reassurance, for noise. So when life suddenly becomes quiet, when conversations disappear, when support becomes limited, when you find yourself sitting alone with emotion you once distracted yourself from, it can feel terrifying. At first, you question everything. You wonder if you did something wrong, if people secretly stopped caring, if life is somehow punishing you. And the hardest part isn't always the physical loneliness. It's the emotional confusion. The feeling that the world kept moving while you were left alone, trying to understand what changed. But what many people never realize is this: isolation has the power to reveal truths that constant distraction hides. Because when the noise disappears, you finally hear yourself clearly. And that changes everything. For the first time, you begin noticing how exhausted you truly were. How much energy was spent trying to maintain connections that constantly drained you. How often you ignored your intuition just to avoid disappointing others. How frequently you sacrificed your peace for temporary acceptance. Isolation exposed those patterns, not to destroy you, but to wake you up. Because there's a version of yourself that can only be discovered in solitude. A stronger version, a wiser version, a more emotionally grounded version. Something old in you has to break first. That's why isolation often feels painful before it becomes powerful. It forces confrontation. Confrontation with your fears, your habits, your emotional wounds, your dependence on external validation. And most people spend their entire lives avoiding that confrontation. They stay surrounded by distractions because silence forces honesty. But your life pushed you into that silence for a reason. Every lonely night taught you something. Every moment of emotional distance sharpened your awareness. Every season where you felt unsupported forced hidden strength to develop internally. You started learning how to survive without constant reassurance. And survival changed you. You became more observant, more intentional, more connected to your inner voice. The things that once controlled your emotions slowly lost power over you, because isolation teaches emotional independence. It teaches you how to stand alone without falling apart, and that lesson is priceless. At some point, you stopped fearing solitude. You stopped seeing quiet moments as emptiness, stopped seeing distance as punishment, stopped seeing isolation as proof that you were unwanted. You began seeing it differently. You realized isolation had protected you from environments that were weakening your spirit, protected you from constant noise, protected you from people who only valued the version of you that lacked boundaries. And once that realization appears, everything changes internally, because now your strength no longer comes from who stands beside you. It comes from knowing you survived moments you once believed would destroy you. That's real power. The ability to remain emotionally steady even when life becomes uncertain. The ability to rebuild yourself privately. The ability to continue growing without applause, validation, or recognition. Isolation taught you that. Not motivational speeches. Not temporary inspiration. Experience. Painful experience. And painful experiences often become the greatest teachers. Because once you survive deep loneliness, you stop fearing temporary separation. Once you rebuild yourself in silence, you stop depending on outside noise to feel valuable. And once you truly discover your own resilience, People can no longer control you through emotional withdrawal. That's why isolation didn't break why. Our spirit. It revealed your spirit. It stripped away distractions until you finally met the strongest version of yourself. The version that no longer needs constant approval to feel worthy. The version that trusts intuition more than outside opinions. The version that understands peace is more valuable than forced connection. And maybe that's what your difficult seasons were really preparing you for all along. Not destruction. Transformation. Some people disappear from your life not because you failed, but because your transformation no longer matches their comfort. And that truth is difficult to accept at first. Because when people become distant, when conversations fade, when support suddenly disappears, the human mind immediately searches for personal failure. You start questioning yourself. Maybe I changed too much. Maybe I became too quiet. Maybe I expected too much from people. Maybe I wasn't enough. But growth has a strange effect on relationships. It reveals which connections were built on authenticity and which ones were only built on familiarity. Because not everyone connects with the real you. Some people connect with the version of you that was easy to control, easier to influence, easier to predict. The version that tolerated disrespect just to keep peace. The version that constantly overextended emotionally. The version that stayed available no matter how exhausted they felt internally. But transformation changes that. Slowly, quietly, your standards begin shifting. You start valuing peace differently. You stop entertaining constant negativity. You stop forcing connections that leave you emotionally drained. And the moment that happens, certain people begin feeling uncomfortable around you. Not because you attacked them, not because you became arrogant, but because your energy no longer fits the dynamic they were used to. Growth changes patterns. And people who benefited from your old patterns often struggle to adjust. That's why some relationships become distant during personal transformation. Your evolution silently challenges the comfort of others, especially those who never expected you to become stronger emotionally. Because when you begin healing, you also begin noticing things you once ignored, the manipulation you excused, the disrespect you normalized, the emotional imbalance you kept tolerating out. Of fear of losing connection. Awareness changes everything. And once awareness expands, you cannot fully return to unconscious living. That's why your circle may have become smaller. Not because your value decreased, because your tolerance changed. You no longer find comfort in shallow conversations. No longer feel connected to environments that constantly exhaust your spirit. No longer feel the need to chase people who only appreciated your presence when you abandoned yourself to keep them comfortable. And some people interpret that change personally, because your transformation unintentionally exposes their resistance to growth. Your calmness reminds them of their chaos. Your boundaries remind them of their lack of discipline. Your self-respect reminds them of the access they no longer have. And instead of growing with you, they slowly distance themselves. Not always out of hatred, sometimes out of discomfort. Because people naturally gravitate toward environments that validate their current identity. And your transformation stopped validating old patterns. That's why certain connections faded naturally. Not every relationship is meant to survive every version of you. Some people are connected to a chapter, not the entire story. And holding on to expired connections too tightly can delay your own growth. Because deep down, you already feel when something no longer aligns. You feel it in forced conversations, forced energy, forced effort. You notice when your spirit feels heavy after certain interactions, and ignoring those signals only creates emotional exhaustion over time. That's why growth sometimes requires separation, not as punishment, as alignment. Life begins removing what can no longer grow with you. And although painful, that process creates space. Space for healthier connections, healthier thinking, healthier identity. But before that new season arrives, there is often loneliness. A temporary space between who you used to be and who you are becoming. And many people misunderstand that stage. They think loneliness means failure. But sometimes loneliness is simply evidence of transition. Evidence that your life is evolving internally before it fully changes externally. And during that transition, You begin understanding something powerful. You cannot force people to grow with you. You cannot force emotional maturity, cannot force understanding, cannot force loyalty. And trying to force connection usually leads to self-betrayal. That's why real growth often requires acceptance. Acceptance that some people will misunderstand your transformation. Some people will leave once your boundaries become stronger. Some people will only support the version of you that required less accountability from them. And that has nothing to do with your worth. It simply means your evolution no longer matches their comfort. But never shrink your growth just to remain emotionally accessible to people committed to staying the same. Because your peace matters too. Your healing matters too. Your future matters too. And every difficult separation taught you something important. The right people will not require you to abandon your growth in order to keep their connection. Real connections evolve with honesty, with respect, with mutual understanding, not control, not guilt, not emotional dependency. That's why some endings were necessary, not because you failed, but because you finally stopped abandoning yourself to keep others comfortable. And that decision changes your life forever.